Well, hello everybody. My name is Greg Odell. I'm the President and CEO of Events DC. Please forgive my COVID casual attire, but we do hope that all of you are safe during these difficult times. So we believe the Walter E. Washington Convention Center has the best kept secret in our amazing art collection. We have a $4 million art collection here in our building, and outside of any of the museums, it's one of the largest in all of Washington, D.C. We have over 130 unique pieces of artwork, sculpture, and photography. So we put together an amazing virtual tour that we really think you'll enjoy. Now, out of an abundance of caution, all of our curators and our artists will be wearing masks while filmed, but we don't think this will diminish in any way this amazing tour that you're going to enjoy. So with that, we hope that you stay safe, and we hope to see you soon. Take care and God bless.
Hello, I'm Dina Crossan.
And I'm Robin Moore. Together, we're the curators of the permanent art collection installed throughout the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for joining us for Behind the Canvas, produced by Events DC. As curators of this 137 art object collection, specifically chosen during the construction of the 2.3 million square foot convention center, we have enjoyed showing the collection to hundreds and hundreds of art enthusiasts doing actual tours.
During these unprecedented times, given the global pandemic, we're delighted to share selections from the collection with you on this virtual platform. Behind the Canvas features several DC area artists discussing their artworks in the DC Convention Center collection.
Today you're in for a treat from the comfort of your computer, your tablet, or your smartphone, because we're going to be talking about some of the pieces in the collection that are often seen during an actual tour.
And with that, let's get started.
One of the most amazing pieces in the collection is a piece by Jim Sanborn called Lingua.
One thing I love about this piece, it greets you when you walk in the building, but there are these two epic bronze columns that are hollow and that are punched out, so they have like the stature of a classical temple or classical meeting place statuary, and they're using bronze, which would be normally figural, but they're so engaging with the type, and the letters are pieced into the bronze columns, and there's a very, very bright light inside. So I love that they project that light onto people when they walk in. There's a little bit of a feeling of lightness.
It's especially beautiful at night with the lights on, and they're positioned in the grand lobby, and they also have the distinction, the two pillars of being commissioned specifically for that space when the building was constructed in 2003. So it's really one of the signature pieces, I would say, of the whole collection.
I agree completely. And one of my favorite things about the collection is that they draw you in as an individual, because their core message is about people gathering to share ideas, to make agreements, to form peace agreements, to make decisions together, to create and collaborate. And the texts on the columns, each column has 4 registers, and each register has a quote from a historical document, or in one case, a piece of fiction, about times in history when people have made agreements. And the languages include Russian, which is a selection from Tolstoy's War and Peace about the War of 1812. There's a piece in the Iroquois language. There's works in French, English, Chinese, Amharic, I believe. So it really makes people feel when they're walking in, if they think about it a minute, that they're engaging in this long line of history, of coming together, and of being individuals, and also of representing their cultures.
And also there's really an aesthetic aspect to the languages themselves, because each one is in a different alphabet. So most people can't read all those languages, so they can seem obscure without being translated, but the shapes themselves convey meaning and message.
Absolutely.
And then as they're cast onto the shadows, onto the wall, and onto the floor.
It makes you relate to them as sculpture, as forms, as abstract forms, because at least one of those languages is going to be, foreign to you. It's going to really look like just a cool visual detail. And then at the same time, because it's light and because there's this combination of things, it's really like a conceptual piece that engages all these other levels of thought.
It does.
I just love
that. It does. I always think that it must have been so fun for the artist for for Jim Sanborn to choose the text that he has. As you said, one is Tolstoy, one is a speech given in the Roman Senate during the years of the Roman Empire. It's just stories through time, and all of them are actual events except for the Tolstoy War and Peace.
Yeah, I think that it's just a very relatable, it's a very warm and relatable piece that has this very big formal bounce to it too. So just when you come into the convention center, right after you pass the Sanborn, to the left, there's this very epic piece by Donald Lipsky called 5 Easy Pieces that also has a really special relationship to the architecture.
It does. It's just as there's really this sort of dramatic meaning in the Jim Sanborn, with the Lipsky, there's a certain whimsy and playfulness to it because these enormous objects, kayaks, bicycles, are suspended from a very, very high ceiling, and you come across it usually as you're descending along escalators. So at first you're sort of on eye level, and then you're underneath it. And it's objects that people sort of play with, really, that makes it so charming. But at the same time, it's monumental.
Right. And again, it has that combination of sort of the geometry of all the tennis rackets lined up. Mm. And then you have the delight of like, why the heck are there like 84 tennis rackets in the convention center? You know, it's a playful thing about like recontextualizing objects, thinking about them in different ways. Mm-hmm.
And it's about recreation, leisure, things that people do together.
Right. Bicycling, kayaking.
Or bar stools.
Bar stools. Yeah, I love showing that piece to people. They really get a kick out of it, especially if they can ride down and up the escalator under it.
Yeah. Another one of the real standouts, and also a very large piece, is by the artist Larry Kirkland, and it's called Capital Stars.
I love capital stars. Capital stars consists of these concentric rings, and they talk about all the states of the Union, and the outer ring is maps of the states in size order, starting with the largest state, Alaska, and then then you have Texas, and and you go all around until you get to the very bottom, and I think it's Rhode Island. It's Rhode Island at the end.
Yeah.
And then the inner ring has the postal codes for all 50 states in the order in which they joined the Union. So the first 13 are the first 13 colonies, and then it goes around.
It's really sort of again, a little bit whimsical, but a testimony to the 50 states in the Union of the United States, and then as the District of Columbia being the heart of government, and where it all sort of comes out from. So it's a, what's the word? I think it's appropriate to its location and reminds us that we are in the capital city.
Right. I love that about that piece. And then somebody pointed out too that there's coins in it. There's these, so it's got these big concentric rings, but then he's got these rings that are sort of feel like they're rotating. They're not really moving, but they're off center. Mm-hmm. And it gives you a sense of instability. And on those rings, there's coins with the presidential outline, sort of abstracted US coins, which is marking that one of the reasons for founding, a republic and a federal organization for the US was to print currency. Mm-hmm. So we've got a united currency, but we've got all these different histories and time frames.
Right.
And then you've got, DC is coming out at the center of that arrow that's piercing through this brilliant blue star.
And again, it's one of those very large suspended works that you can see from more than one vantage point.
And I think people get very intrigued when they're coming up from the concourse and they can sort of only see a part of it, because you really have to be flat on to understand all the symbols.
That's right. That's right.
It's a really exciting piece that we're lucky to have. Mm-hmm. Another favorite I know that we both love a lot is the Kendall Buster Parabiosis 2, which greets people outside the M Street lobby, perhaps after they've registered and they're going in for a meeting.
The Kendall Buster's piece is so amazing. I love to ask visitors what it reminds them of. It's these billowing white, sort of cloud-like forms, again suspended from the ceiling, but they're not the least bit soft or organic, as the title might indicate, Parabiosis 2. In fact, they're made out of a metal armature and wire mesh cloth, so they're actually very architectural and very structured.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they give this feeling of sort of billowing life.
Right. Yeah, they're sort of cold in the way they're made, like almost steampunky or something, mm-hmm. except that they're nice bright white. But then when you get under it and you sort of study the forms, they look like they could be wave forms or leaf forms or cells dividing.
Yeah, cells dividing or a spaceship.
Spaceship,
You know, that
definitely.
you could stand underneath and get sucked up into another dimension.
And
something
even
like
just
that.
clouds, which is, you
Yeah.
know, such a good source of ideas when say you're at a meeting and you're having trouble breaking through, what would you do? You might look up at the clouds if you could
It's
see
very
them.
abstract, but it's very approachable at the same time. It's on a human scale.
I think that piece really delights people, and I think the fact that it's just above their heads makes it feel different. It's a little bit like you have to engage with it, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those. To me, it's like a think piece. It's where the materiality is sort of in contrast to the concept in a
Right.
way that's sort of like, you know, antithesis, thesis, and then synthesis.
Right. And
Yeah.
then if all that sort of our curator talk about materiality and all that doesn't get people, that it certainly captures their imagination.
Oh yeah,
It's just such a likable piece. I think
it
everybody
is. It is.
engages with it.
So the Shaw wall is really kind of the heart of the collection in some ways. Wouldn't you say that, Robin?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Consisting of 4 pieces by 4 different artists, or an artist team and 3 other artists. This whole conception, the Shaw Wall was conceived to honor the neighborhood of Shaw, which is where the convention center is. And at the time that this really big 2.3 million square foot building was being constructed, there was a lot of care and concern about displacement of neighbors,
Yep.
of shopkeepers, and what it was going to mean, this big footprint building coming into an existing neighborhood.
Right.
So the idea was to celebrate and honor Shaw, which has tons of history for Washington, D.C.
Right. A super rich history, super old neighborhood. Yeah. One of the things I love about the first piece by Frank Smith and Arnetta Lee, it's called Shaw, the Roots and Fabric of a Community,
Right.
is that piece, which is just this huge sprawl of images and information and historical stuff laid out on a map. It's just enormous and really rich and interesting. That piece was created with sparks from a call that they did to the community to send in postcards and letters with stories and pictures that they didn't want lost or that they would like to have included. And it looks to me like they've incorporated pretty much all of those.
Oh, the legend
Really
is,
dense.
you could look at the things on the legend and then find them on the map for hours. It's just so full of history and incident and memory. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And the Rick Freeman piece is a testament to, I would say, more the creativity and artistry in Shaw. And people don't necessarily know this, but before World War I, the Shaw neighborhood, before the Civil War, and during the Civil War and after, had been a rather prosperous place for free African Americans. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, there was like a smaller version of the Harlem Renaissance.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
so Langston Hughes was here, and then of
Yep.
course later Duke Ellington was here, and there was a lot of poets, writers, and
There's-
music.
And 3 or 4 prominent female artists who
Yeah.
come down to us.
That's right. So that piece is a real, and it has
The central figure of Marvin Gaye.
the Marvin Gaye, right?
So I love that it combines Rick's personal history and his personal experience of Shaw and of DC
Right.
with this longer thread of history. There's so many threads in it, and you'll hear more from Rick later. They'll hear more from Rick later.
Right, Rick
in
is one of the artists that you'll get
that we interviewed later.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. Billy Colbert's piece called "The Spirit of Sunday in Shaw" is this very warm sort of photo collage piece.
Yeah, and again, it's about history in a way that is not, sort of didactic or talking to you, but rather letting you feel. And a photograph of the 2 children, the brother and sister, dressed in their best clothes. Maybe it was Easter,
Right.
something like that, and just so darling. And an atmosphere, I think, of African American prosperity, pride, community, that is the history of Shaw.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Deirdre Saunders' piece that's right behind us, Moments in Time and Place. It's another piece that recontextualizes historical photographs and shares the stories on the caption.
This one is a little more elusive. It leaves you being able to read into the various words, sort of what you feel.
Right,
and
right.
So she's not leading you by the hand, but rather sort of opening a window or a door
Right.
for you to ponder and think about
Right.
you know, the history of this neighborhood.
I
and
feel
what it
like the
means.
Billy Colbert piece and the Rick Freeman piece both have this very like person-to-person approach that feels like it's an individual talking to you or telling you stories. And this one feels like these things have just been pulled together in this formal framework, but it's really rich, and it's another way of looking at it.
Yeah,
One
it's
thing
like, go ahead.
One thing I like to point out to people is that those two figures in the corner are Mr. and Mrs. Scurlock, who ran one of the photo studios, a storefront photo studio where people would go to get their graduation pictures and their wedding pictures taken. And the Scurlocks' photographs are used in some context in the three other works.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
There's
It's
two
a real
people
thread
who
that
had
ties
this
it all
little
together.
grassroots business
Yeah,
became this really important anchor for the neighborhood's history. I love that.
yeah, me too.
Okay, so the next piece that we're going to talk about is the Solowit wall drawing. It's wall drawing number 1103. It is painted on a spiral staircase that goes from the first to the second floors, which is a pretty huge, just even as a staircase, it's impressive.
Well, it's a lot of things at the same time. It's an architectural element because it is a working spiral staircase that people who come to the convention center can ascend or descend.
Right.
So it's a way to get to another floor. But it's much more than that.
Right. And Solowit's known, as we know, as a pioneer of minimalist and conceptual art. The piece was purchased by the Convention Center's original panel and curators as a 2-page set of instructions to be implemented on site. There was a team of about 20 local artists who worked on actually painting the piece and putting it together according to very specific instructions provided by the artist studio.
Well, that is sort of the hallmark both of Solowit and of minimalism itself, in that the idea of authorship, or the painter in their studio painting away or making something out of a tortured soul. It's not like that at all. It's, it should be this high, and it should be in these colors, and you just write it on a notepad, and then he signs that.
Right.
And then the execution is completed by other people.
Right, and they're credited and they're paid professionally.
Right.
So the artwork as an economic thing becomes articulated and specific instead of like behind the scenes.
And it's meant to be impersonal in a way that I think for the minimalist movement had an authenticity that was missing from more sort of narrative paintings that were about a person's psyche or their soul.
Right. You know, when I was younger, I used to find all that work very cold. And now that I feel like I'm a more empowered viewer of it and I've seen enough of it, I feel like that's providing the viewer with more freedom to enjoy the work and to appreciate it, that they don't have to like get the piece, right?
Yeah, and one of the things I like about the Solowit work also is that when you go up it or down, there's a couple of sort of windows in it, so that parts of it it's very dark and you can't see very well, and then you come out into the light, and then and when you emerge at the top, you can look out to the whole city, the big panoramic view of the city,
Right.
and through the big windows. And one of the really cool things about it is that it can be seen from the street, so especially at night when it's illuminated. People are walking by, they can look up and see this multicolored, circular, giant structure inside
Right.
the building, which I think is just so cool.
Yeah. That's another point about the art collection that's really important, is that it really was conceived as a public collection, and all these big pieces, these really big ones that we're talking about that were site-specific, are all visible from some view outside the building. And the building overall has so much window space and so much natural light entering it, which I think was really different at the time that it was built, especially considering the size and the bulk of the building. That those were important messages of transparency and an effort to integrate it a little more into the community and the communities, and to honor foot traffic.
And again, the experience of being inside the building, people coming here for conventions, going to meetings, and sort of maybe trudging a little bit from this session to that session, but they're in this really light-filled structure that's just studded with these amazing works of art.
Right, and they can look out and see the actual city from
Yeah.
inside their
Yeah.
sanctuary too, yeah. So Steve Kushner's Swings is just switching scales a little bit, is a very large but an individual painting that's located up on the 3rd floor.
Right, and Steve is one of the ones that we were able to talk with personally in front of the work of art, so those watching behind the canvas will be able to listen to him talk and see him talk about his work.
I love the way he uses this sort of repetition of forms, but every time they're different, every time they have a presence and a personality. And
Yeah, I feel to me his work is very sort of nature-based,
Yeah.
but if you didn't know what nature was, you know. But it doesn't, his forms don't necessarily resemble something that you recognize, but they have an organic feel to them.
They definitely have an organic feel and an imaginative feel, in addition to being sort of sophisticated and abstract.
Well, he uses duplication and repetition,
Yeah.
you know, to sort of drive home his point, but at the same time, I think it's a very direct visual message.
And they're beautiful.
Yeah,
They're really beautifully
well,
finished and beautifully made.
that's always important.
So the Rick Freeman Shaw rhythms is, we talked about a little bit during talking about the Shaw Wall, but again, you're going to get to hear about him in the video. A little later on, we were able to interview him.
I think that the work by Stephen Hendee titled Reignition is one of the most unusual pieces in terms of its, again, materiality in the whole collection. It's a little bit tucked away, so people don't always necessarily come upon it, but when they do, it's very striking because it's so light-filled, right? And prominent and large.
Right, and it looks like stained glass. It's got that bright color and the back lid and the sort of fragmented geometric shapes, so that if you're up on the third floor and you're sort of wandering, which room am I supposed to be in? It is a little more dark up there, and then this very bright thing calls to you.
And what he had to say about it, he's one of the artists that, that came in to talk to us, was so interesting. And he comes really from a sort of a deep philosophical background. And he works a lot today in the digital world. So that piece to me is sort of a bridge, again, between something that could be a stained glass window that could be in a medieval church to something that could be digitized into a screen, never to have 3 dimensions again.
Interesting.
So there's this byplay there as well.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Al Smith is another artist who we were able to interview. Al Smith had a long career teaching at Howard University, and he's sort of a master painter in the photorealist tradition, although his recent work, I know we're going to hear more about his inspirations.
Yes, and he's so eloquent on the subject too. I learned a lot from him when he came in to talk to us. It's beautiful, enormous, not quite photorealism, but close to it, I would say.
Close to it, yeah.
And a street scene, a city scene, and each person depicted is unique and different. So you can really get caught up in tracing people's faces or their clothing or what they're doing, where they're headed. And it's a perfect rendition of the actual corner that it shows. And so as we've talked about a couple of pieces already, it's very specific to Washington, D.C. And I really like that about it. And people love to find someone that looks like someone they know or could be someone they know in a photograph or a painting. And I think his work has that sort of compelling quality of,
Definitely.
do I know anyone in this? Is that me?
Yeah, people love to look at that and sort of make up stories about it.
Yeah, it is because there are stories there. And I think he intended that deliberately. And he, in fact, when he talks about choosing people to include, depending on sort of how they stood or their mien, you know, he was looking for stories that made sense to him. Yeah.
That's really great.
So a lot of the artists in our collection here are local, are DC based, although we do have pieces by people from all over the country, all over the world, internationally famous, like Saul LeWitt. But some of the local artists are the most dear to my heart. And one of them is Yuriko Yamaguchi. And her piece in our collection is part of her Metamorphoses series, where she's really dealing with, again, organic, natural forms, but imbuing them with, I think, sort of moral meaning, ethical meaning, spiritual meaning. So they're abstract in that way, but then they're also very recognizable as natural forms.
Right. She makes these beautiful objects that she carves them out of wood, and then in this case, she cast them in bronze and patinaed them. So they have really appealing texture and surface. But I agree with you that they have a sort of a combination of a universal meaning and a very personal meaning. And when we see her video, we're going to get to hear her tell us how that comes together.
Well, she's such a thoughtful person. You know, she goes deep, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know she had a strong vision of how that piece fit into the convention center.
Yeah, because it has a political message as well about peace, about understanding, that sort of thing, about communities coming together rather than fighting or
Right.
at odds. So it's it's sort of these are peacemaker gestures, I think, that she wants that message to be part of the sensibility of the piece.
I agree, and it's more relevant than ever that we use art as a healing force, and I think Eureka really has that vision.
Right. Well, art lifts us up and makes us better. So that's why it's so fabulous that this collection is even here.
Absolutely. We're so lucky to be here.
We are.
My name is Alfred Smith, Alfred J. Smith, and the name of the work is called Crossings. It's 8 feet by 24 feet across. And it was done in about 1985. Most of my work I consider to be visual music, in that I tell a story about studying drumming. And a drummer tried to explain to me that all a drummer is doing is playing with time. And I realized that all I'm doing is playing with space in the work. I use perspective to divide the space into, for example, 1-point perspective at the edges and the middle, and then the other 2 spaces, quarters or fifths, into 2-point perspective. And so I bend the space back to the 2-dimensional plane. There are many other elements in the painting that suggest music. I use a lot of patterns and rhythms. I consider the people to be the melody of the work and the improvisations. Well, my father was a traditional sign painter and commercial artist. And my grandfather was also a sign painter and fine art painter. As a matter of fact, my grandfather painted Christ in our church. And as I would think of it being the first painting I had ever seen as a 3-year-old or so. And at the back of the church, I would always turn around to look at something that looked so real. And as I grew up, it was like a Renaissance painting. I mean, he was that good. And my father was known all up and down the East Coast as, I considered him to be a performer. Whenever he would paint signs in windows and things, he would draw crowds. He would draw crowds because of the way that his hands moved as a maestro. They were so graceful. And his hands danced. Since that time, I've come up with concepts called the dance of doing. And rhythm is foundational to any and everything that we do. Saying that the people walk with a cadence. And by the way, the work wasn't done at one moment, although it suggests being done at one moment. At M Street and Rhode Island Avenue and Connecticut Avenue, every time the light changed, people would, to me, audition for the work. The lights inside of the building are like piano notes to me. And so for me, even though the work is photorealistic, it all collapses down to abstract music and rhythm. I would also say this in terms of the way that I go after detail, okay? Say the human eye only sees one thing in focus at a time. It scans the picture plane. Yet we know that we see everything in the moment, everything at once, okay? And so as I get you to scan the picture plane, you see, whatever the eye attends to is in focus, and that happens over time. So in that way, the work becomes time-based, all right? Another, for example, if you look at on the far right of the painting is Mel Art Jewelers, right? I went in and painted all the watches and thing in the window from that distance. Of course, you couldn't see it, but you could zoom the camera and you can go in and see it. And if you look at the layout and spacing of all the watches in the window, they create a polyrhythm. That's what I see, and that's what I'm trying to show you. In the athletic shoebox, there's a reflection of the bus and all of that, but I painted the sneakers. And they're all lined up there, and they have their pattern and their rhythm to the sneakers. So again, the process of seeing is like the process of hearing. It's like visual music. I consider it in terms of an everyday genre painter, you know. But yes, it has a very spiritual, and there are pictorial devices that I would use to create a very spiritual feel. It's backlit, and so all the shadows come to the foreground and things. And so it has that kind of Renaissance spiritual light, that pictorial device, where it's emanating from the center and on out. So, you know, I would have control over things like that. People like audition for the painting. And you know, I would, some people were in the foreground, some people in the background. Every time the light changed, I would select people and everything, and they could control the perspective. I was able to bring people to the foreground, send them back in space, but it was their elegance and their dignity in a very everyday way. And I talk about the diversity of notes, and they moved as dancers. Even, you know, an elderly woman stepping off of the curb over here, you know. And there's certain people that you just have empathy for them and things. And that comes from all different cultures. It comes from all different backgrounds, all different occupations. The painter walks across the street with as much dignity as the lawyer. And there are many lawyers, you know. On one side, there's a guy on a motorcycle. On the other side, there's a policeman who has dignity. In terms of I would call it the target audience, I knew it would be downtown DC. And it was a portrait of DC. I see DC as a cosmopolitan, you know, city and things. And again, it's a crossroads of many different countries. They were all the embassies and things. And it was supposed to be in the cafeteria area at the old convention center. So I knew that people would see it, they would come there, they would, and I wanted them to, every time they came, I wanted people to see more and see more and see more. And little events, little stories being played out. And there's a man selling flowers way over there, you know, in the corner. But he looked like an opera singer. So I said, well, let me get him. You know? And so people, to me, they would audition for the work. And I would say that you can participate in the work. That corner is still there. There's a place where M Street, Rhode Island Avenue, and Connecticut Avenue meet, right? And so you can stand there and you can pick up the polyrhythm. And, you know, when I talk about cadence, there's a certain kind of cadence when people cross the street back and forth, you know. Every day when you go out, you can't miss that, and you hear it. You hear the way people, you can put music to how people walk, you know, their cadence to how they walk and things. And so those are the kinds of things that I wanted people, as they revisited the work in the old convention center, I wanted them to see more and more and more, you know. Thankfully and gratefully, this work that we're doing now, in terms of virtual work, will allow it to be shown, and you know, for people who come in and don't necessarily walk over to the side, and maybe that will invite them to come in and walk over to the side and scan the work to see what it's about.
My name is Stephen Hendee, and I'm the artist of the work behind me. It's called Reignition. It's from 2003. It's made from polycarbonate and enamel car paint, as well as a lighting system. This is a style in which I've been working since 1997, and it is now known as low poly aesthetic, and it was inspired by depictions of the idea of the early internet, the idea that digital information needed some signifier, some way to visualize what it might look like. So there were writers and artists during that time period that were trying to come up with ways of conceiving of and describing those spaces. And so in some ways I attributed the work of people like Sid Mead, who was a futurist who worked in film, as well as the writing of people like William Gibson, who were talking about the concept of cyberspace, and reading those depictions and thinking about, well, what would those spaces look like? So I was also interested in the history of the early internet, and one of the concepts for that space was that it was going to be made three-dimensionally through a language called VRML. And VRML would have made the internet a three-dimensional space that people would have traveled in instead of a two-dimensional space that you would see on a screen. So I was really interested in using VRML language to create some of my early sculptures. And they're very planar, rectilinear, verticed work. And so this language, building things in that space, led to me making more advanced work, more ambitious objects. So the aesthetic of this work is seated in that investigation, that formal investigation. It's abstraction, but I'm also thinking about these other spaces. Thinking about the relationship between, like I said, this digital space, but also thinking about that as a place where we become disembodied and we think about ideas beyond ourselves. And I think that, you know, the idea of the church or spirituality or those concepts is about being in these other places and imagining and idealizing the way we see ourselves. And I think of, there's this interesting etching, a medieval etching called the Flammarion, which is a depiction of a person breaking through the celestial spheres and being able to see the world outside of the one that we know. And so when I think of stained glass, I think of that was what those expectations were of that moment, of those stories becoming literally illuminated, and they're like virtual in a way. And so thinking of the stained glass, you know, it was important to me to bring about this kind of imagery. When I was quite young, I actually lived in the DC area for a number of years, and my parents would take me to the museums on the mall. And it left a huge impression on me, this idea of this cultural story being told, that there could be people who are contributing to it in one way or another. And that idea that there are people being able to make things and craft things and create images that people pass on and take care of was something that didn't leave me. When I lived in Southern California, I had the opportunity to see a lot of contemporary art. As a teenager, I would explore the museums in the Southland. And I saw work by Roland Rees and Chris Burden. One of them is now a painter, and the other one a sculptor largely, but did do performance art. And when I saw that work, both of them were making things that were expansive and were creating context with the work itself. And so I was inspired by those gestures, this idea that you could create an entire world and then have people inhabit that world. And so At some point, one of my parents said to me, "You're never going to go to college without getting a scholarship of some kind. So you have to be very good at what you're doing." It was on me. So art was the thing that I really cared about, and it meant a lot to me. So I worked very hard to craft things and objects and images that would enable me to move forward, to go to an art school. And so I went to a number of different institutions to learn how to, be a better artist. This commission was one of the first times that I'd ever been able to make work that was going to be collected in this way. And so it meant a lot to me to be able to create a work that would then, that would exist and carry through into a space where a lot of people would have access to it. It's not a museum, but there's a lot of people who at some point were coming through here, just for the moment, maybe not, but it enables a lot of viewers to see the work. A large amount of my work is now virtual. It's digital in nature. By working three-dimensionally in a computer, for example, I can make versions of my work that can be fabricated or refabricated in any medium at any scale. So this work like this led to me developing CAD designs for now hundreds of different projects that I will hopefully at some point be able to build in the future. Shortly after I completed this work, I moved to Las Vegas, and I won a competition for a piece that I created there for the Centennial Time Capsule for the city of Las Vegas. It's called the Monument to the Simulacrum, and it was a piece dedicated to French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, considering that he had written about the city in some of his books, and the opportunity for the time capsule to inhabit that concept. So that piece is in downtown Las Vegas. It was a piece that was created digitally and then digitally fabricated out of stainless steel. So this piece, in some ways, like the geometry and the intent behind the content allowed for this other work to occur. And now I largely make smaller works, smaller sculptural works, but those pieces are often from a digital source. It's hard to boil down why one decides to become an artist at a young age. I think enough examples were shown to me of the value, the cultural value of contributing to a dialogue, that it seemed like a meaningful pursuit to me. And the idea of making things that are durable enough and cared for in order to pass that idea on to other people. I mean, as a young person, I was inspired by artists who came to that idea with the same intent. And so, I guess it's important to me to be a part of that, part of a lineage.
Hi, I'm Rick Freeman, and I'm going to discuss my painting, Shaw Rhythms. Well, I consider myself a narrative painter, and actually that was something that was given to me about maybe 20 years ago by a friend who looked at my work, and she just said, "You're a narrative painter," and I asked her, "What does that mean to you?" And she said, "Well, a narrative painter is a person whose works tell stories." And I thought for me that was it just fit, because I've always loved a good story. When I was growing up, I would listen, or as my grandmama used to say, I would eavesdrop on grown folks' stories. And I would listen to them, and I would see these pictures in my head. And from those pictures in my head, I would draw. And so that's, I guess, the short of how I became a narrative painter. The piece is called Shaw Rhythms. It has to do, for me, I moved into the neighborhood at 14th and Corcoran. And previous to that, I had lived at 14th and Shepherd Street. And so when I moved into 14th and Corcoran around 1993, I believe, and I've always been fascinated by that history of U Street, DC, Black Broadway, and I wanted to have some elements, if not all elements of that in this piece. Marvin Gaye was very central to the piece because in '93 I did a mural at 13th and U Street that featured Marvin Gaye. Cardozo High School was right up the street from there, and Marvin went to Cardozo. Marvin Gaye as an artist and as a musician is very central to my life. When I heard his album, What's Going On, I was a young teenager, about 14, 15 years old. And that's the first music I ever remember hearing that really took me out of my world and made me think about the world in general. So all of that went into putting Marvin into this piece. And given that that mural at 13th and U Street had been covered over, so I wanted to, again, pay my tribute to Marvin and include him in another piece. The gentleman, or the family picture on the, if you're facing, it's on the upper left-hand corner, that's a neighbor of mine when I lived at 14th and Corcoran, Butch. I can't remember Butch's last name, but he grew up right here in the Shaw area. And I saw that picture, and I thought it was just so cute because that's Butch as a baby that's being held. And of course, I was talking to Butch as a grown man and a bootlegger. And so I was just like, it was just an interesting, dichotomy of like little Butch and Butch, give me a beer, man. So I wanted to include that in there. The people, the men on the left-hand side, right-hand side, upper right, with the kind of typical row house rooftops behind them, those men are representative of the community back in 1919 during Red Summer in DC, which was part of that, where there were riots up at 7th Street, roughly 7th and U, or Georgia and U. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, called out the Marines and Navy to come over. What had happened with the riots here in DC, that all started because of a woman on a streetcar, a white woman, accused a black man of filling her up, touching her, molesting her, which didn't happen. And that set off everything. And like I said, Woodrow Wilson called all the Navy and Marines out. The black folks in that neighborhood, that's where Howard University is, LaDroit Park, everything over there, that whole area was African American. It was all the businesses up and down U Street, the clubs, the restaurants, all of that was black owned. Those men came out and defended their neighborhood. The couple dancing, mid left side, they and the pianist are representative of the jazz age, which is very popular. I know DC, the music now is go-go, but DC was a jazz city long before it was a go-go city. There's Colonel Robert Shaw, who the area of the neighborhood is named after, Robert Gould Shaw, who was the commander of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the only Negro troops, the first Negro troops in the Civil War. And so he commanded them. A lot of those died in South Carolina fighting for the nation, for the Union Army. I wanted to include him because it is called Shaw. It's named after him. Also, several years ago, there was a mural project that was up. And I wanted to include him in the piece and was told by a resident, well, why do you want to include him? He's not from DC, doesn't live here, never lived here, and all this, that, and the other. And I just kind of looked at him and I said, well, it's called Washington, DC, and George Washington never lived here either. So, Go figure. Anyway, that's why I wanted to put him in there. Then the young lady is a young Latina. She's sitting on the steps, she's reading, and that's to show that the neighborhood is changing, and change is good sometimes. And so that's wanting to show that mix of Latinos in the neighborhood. When I was a kid, stories, they always captured my mind. When I would hear people talking, grown folks in particular, their stories, what their life was about, whether it was gossip or whether there was something that was really happening or had happened. And I would always see these pictures when I was in elementary school, and my mom enrolled me at the library for the summer reading programs. This is right after the libraries in Athens, Georgia had integrated. When I would go and read, I would see stories, and to me it was kind of interesting that you read, Tom, Dick, and Jane or whatever, but I didn't read for the pictures they had in their books. To me, I would read it and I would see the pictures in my head. The same with other novels and stuff like that, or just hearing people. So all of that just transferred to drawing. Well, my work now, it's still very much into the narrative tradition, but I did a series of paintings called the Chitlin Circuit Review, and it was about blues, the early history of blues music. And what I wanted to try to do, I didn't want to do anything that just had a lot of portraits of blues musicians from any particular era. I wanted to do something that actually told, well, where does this music come from? What's the lineage of blues music? And to also show that an underlying theme of that is to show the social and political conditions that caused the birth of the blues. And all of that has to go back through to slavery, because it all came out of field songs, and the field songs and work hollers. They both contributed to not only the blues, but black gospel music, which I've heard it said before, and I've always kind of taken it to truth, especially when you listen to the music, that black gospel and the blues are opposite sides of the same coin. So, but I also wanted to, with that, show that strong connection of the blues, gospel, call and response to the rhythms of Africa, where all of that came from. So that's what I wanted to get into with the meat of that music and that series, and to show the day-to-day life of what regular people did, who the songs, the music, the culture, who it was about, who it was for, how it got there.
My name is Yuriko Yamaguchi. The title of this piece is two sets. One title is Metamorphosis 102 and 103. But in terms of content-wise, I created another title, which is Politics/Power Equal Human Nature. And that indicate the content of the work particularly. And first of all, to this, the left side begin with a wrapped package, which is so mysterious. We don't know what is inside. And then on the second row, it's actually, I want everyone to read from top to bottom instead of left to right. And then on the second row, there is one hand and then one stone on the perm. And we don't know what is this. So on the third, and two heads start arguing about the content. It's very, this is, in Washington, D.C., we have so many different issues, discussed, in the Capitol. And so it's kind of allude to, political situations. And then anyway, we sometimes fight and argue. And then after all, this is the final force. This indicates the debate is over and one feather left in the cage, but it's almost like remnant of a bird. Bird is flied away. So the real whole thing is kind of fried away. And some part of real body is in the cage. Many people think about like a prison. It's okay too. And so anyway, my conclusion is we are in a way end up being in a mysterious conclusion, ending in Washington, D.C. And then the right side, two rectangular things pushing each other to the center, and that represents two powers. Many people think Democrat, Republican, it's okay too. But anyway, opposing power, opposing force. And then in the second, radical things try to divide. To me, it's almost like American pie, divide equally. This is very, very important part for this work because I want this work represent Washington, D.C., also the United States as a whole. And I read the Constitution. I pick up some essential words. And they start from the top: defense, tranquility, welfare. In order to have tranquility in our nation, we have to have good policy of defense and welfare. And then in order to have a peaceful United Nation, I'm not a United Nation, United States, we have to have very good policy of race and gender issues. And third, equality, justice, liberty. We already talking about freedom of choice or freedom of speech and equality for all. But in order to achieve equality of everything, we need a right, correct justice. Otherwise, nothing really worked out. And then the lastly, this is the same one, fortunately. This is look like letter, but I decided not writing any content, but left love. And after all, in our life, what is most important things? Love, I think. Love is most essential, important matter for human life. So, I have that kind of content in this work, but artists always can be interpreted differently according to the viewers. That's fine too. But anyway, for me, it's very important to have thought in order to create the work. This one has two titles, Metamorphosis 102 and 103. The reason is that around that time, I have been working as a series, called Metamorphosis, and that started 1990. And just because I witnessed the Berlin Wall, fell down, and then communist, Soviet Union collapsed, and which is, to me, is a tremendous event. And I wanted to do something that kind of settled me, because I was so agitated. So I decided to do enormous body of work. And then I decided to start from 4 pieces as a group, and then create a story, and vertically, and then when the opportunity to work for DC Convention Center, I realized, although I still want to make Metamorphosis as a series, however, I felt very important to create the work that reflect about Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a capital of the United States, and very political, place. And so in order to indicate the importance of D.C., I generate my idea about what is the essence of politics. That's why I titled Power and a slash and politics equal human nature. I think it's in any country has always debate and then divisions, but that's the human nature I think creates. I was working as a series for Metamorphosis, and for that body of work consists of mostly wood, and a little bit sometimes I use wire, and mostly wood. And then I decided to go with the same material instead of using something else for this. And then, so originally everything is carved wood. So I still have original, wood piece. And then they didn't want to have anything, I don't know, wood is fragile, but they want a more permanent material. So they asked me to cast in bronze. This is, I actually, I have been working with wood for over 20 years. And first I was influenced by Martin Pyer's sculpture, that is wood. And then I liked it, but when you walk wood, you can see I'm standing a lot. And so those wood dust, especially I use the Western cedar, is kind of affected to my body and start showing my reaction to wood dust. And then I realized very important not to continue because my father died of emphysema, so my lung can be ruined. So I changed my material. First I used wire and flax paper, and then changed to cast resin. But especially once I start using cast resin, I can use color, and then also I can make copy much quicker and easily. And then my work grew, and then especially around the time I accidentally read the book, Web of Life, written by Friedrich Capra, who is a philosopher and physicist. And he talked about interconnectedness in our universe, how we are interconnected, not only human and then environmentally, and then ecology, and And that really enlightened me to pursue interconnectedness. And then I had a solo show, New York and DC, but I also was invited to work 1 month in Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center, where I could meet artists from different countries and also scholars and musicians. And then one of the scholars who are attending there noticed my work, and then she asked me to collaborate with her. And that is, I am creating visual images for her mythological stories. She corrected. And then we actually had a show last year in Leiden University in Netherlands. And then previous year, we had a show in Japan. And then next year, we plan to have a similar show in McLean Creative for Arts. But for that show, we decided to include present stage, because her subject matter was the end of the world. And she is really concerned about climate change. And so she wanted to emphasize, to make a connection with mythologies that is ancient. But it's happened a lot of time, deluge and then fire and everything we are noticing. And then especially we are in the climate change programs. So I'm going to do video installation on the other side, and in order to send a message about all the issues. And then also I decided to include pandemic coronavirus too.
So I'm Stephen Kushner. I live and work in Washington, D.C., and I've been here for 42 years. So the painting that's in the Convention Center collection is called Swings. I was thinking about a couple of different elements as I was working on the painting. The first is this back and forth rhythmic motion, which is pretty common in all of my paintings, a sense of repetitive motion, balance, symmetry, and it also, as I was working on the painting, began to feel like a swing set that you would find in a playground, this back and forth motion. You can see from looking at the painting that there are a couple of threads that run through all of my work. The sense of balance, repetition, symmetry, and gesture. So I'm always looking to land somewhere between the gesture and motion of painting and the image that I'm trying to create. If the painting lands too close to gesture, it doesn't feel concrete enough. And if it lands too close to the image, it feels too literal. So I'm always trying to find that balance between gesture and image. I'm always looking to find that balance between the tension of gesture and image, control and accident, intention and reacting to what happens as I'm making the painting. I've been interested in painting from the time I was a little kid, and I was lucky enough to have parents that encouraged me. I had a really wonderful teacher as I was growing up that really taught me the basics of drawing and painting and color and light and proportion and perspective. I was lucky enough to work with Sam Gilliam as my thesis advisor at the University of Maryland when I was getting my MFA degree. And then I had some really wonderful teachers also at Maryland, also some very well-known Washington, D.C. artists. I could name Bill Willis, I can name Chip Richardson, I can name Robin Rose. All of them have been influential in my work, and their work is probably in this collection. So I know the convention collection has a lot of well-known, well-established, successful Washington, D.C. artists, and it's really thrilling for me to be included in the collection with, among others, Sam Gilliam, who, as I said, was a very influential teacher of mine. As you can see from looking at the painting, I'm incredibly repetitive. And so over the years, I've developed a pretty consistent way of working. I always know what the image is going to be before I begin the painting. It usually comes from a very quick little sketch that I'll put in a little notebook. I carry a notebook with me all of the time, and it's full of parts of images, full images. If I don't know what to do next, I'll go through. I have probably 50 notebooks at this point. I'll go through them, I'll look at them backwards, I'll look at them upside down as a way of triggering some new ideas. So each painting develops from a small little sketch, then gets drawn out on the canvas. Then I'm basically wrestling with figure-ground relationship. So I'll paint in the image, I'll paint in the background space, I'll go back and I'll paint in the image, I'll paint the background space to correct the drawing. So it's a back and forth from image to ground to image and to ground. Since my work really deals with gesture, it's what does the human body do in space? I am much more comfortable working large. I'm much more comfortable working in a space that's bigger than me, so that I can really engage my full body. So the painting that's in this collection is maybe a medium-sized painting for me. I find that if I work smaller, the paintings are much more difficult for me to resolve. I teach part-time at George Mason University. I teach drawing and painting, and in the spring, we were all sent home, the teachers and the students, and we had to figure out a way to finish the semester by teaching from a distance. And right now I'm preparing to start the new semester. We're going to also be teaching from a distance. And it's been a really interesting challenge because it forces everybody to rethink the way things have been done, and that there are potentially new ways and possibly better ways to do what we've always been doing. I'm going to be teaching from my own home studio in real time, and I've decided I'm going to be doing the projects along with the students, which I think will give them a very good sense of really how it's done. A lot of beginning students have this idea that artists know what they're doing, they go ahead and they do it, and then they're done. And usually, you kind of know maybe what you want to do, and then things happen along the way, and sometimes the painting works out really well. Sometimes the painting doesn't work out so well. Sometimes the painting turns into something else. Sometimes it ends up in the trash. So I think as a way of imparting that kind of attitude, I'm going to be working along with them, and they can hear what I'm saying. Oh, that color's too dark. Oh, now what about the negative space? And work and talk my way through each project. And I think it'll be an interesting challenge for me, but I also think it's going to be a very good way to teach.
We hope you enjoyed Behind the Canvas and learning more about some of the artists in the collection.
For information about Events DC, check out our website, eventsdc.com, and click on About Us, and then Art Collection.
You can also find us on social media, Twitter @TheEventsDC, Instagram @EventsDC, Facebook, Official Events DC, and YouTube, Events DC. Thanks for tuning in.